So we are going to kick off the content of today's meeting with our presenter, who is the Professor of Emergency Medicine and the Director of Simulation at the Gold Coast Hospital. She's at the vanguard of translational simulation, a concept that's ensuring that simulation remains accountable in its underlying purpose to improve patient care. Any of you who are active on social media will know her as Socratic EM, and all of us in the simulation world have benefited from her wonderful podcast, Simulcast. She's perennially sought after on the speaking circuit, and in a moment you're about to find out why. I'd like to introduce Victoria Brazil, who, as we learn why airway management is far more than a collection of technical skills.
All right, thank you so much, Adam, for the invitation and the introduction, and congratulations, Louise, John, the team, and indeed all of you, because I do think this is some kind of exemplar for us in healthcare to think about how we create events, groups, societies, and activities like this, where we find the people who really need to team together to not just do something at the moment in healthcare, but to reflect really hard on how to make it better. And I think that really is our job as healthcare professionals, not just to deliver care, but to think about how it can be better. So yes, I'm going to talk about teamwork, and there's nothing wrong with everybody's left arm. I'm sure you're all very good at doing a laryngoscopy. But if you're sitting in this room, it's no surprise to know that it's a little bit more than that. So I thought we might start with an example that is familiar to me from the emergency department, and just to get your heart rate up a little bit from where your coffee might have had it. Imagine that you've had this call, whether you're being called down from the operating theatre, the ICU, or indeed whether you're the paramedic involved in the care or the emergency department team waiting to get this patient, and you know this much about them. And what I'd like you to think about, not what your plan is, but if you're just getting to be an observer and thinking about how the team went, what might be the main things that influence the outcome here? What kind of training and preparation do you hope that this team had had? And then whatever happens today, how can we actually make sure that the next time we're there, it's better again? So you don't need to share it with anyone, but I just want you to really think about that for 10 seconds. One of the problems with teamwork and teams is that we think we understand them. We think that because we work in a team that it can't be that hard. And I must admit, I put myself in this category too. And over the last 10 years when I've been doing more in teamwork, I've really just discovered all the things I did not know at a greater volume and rate than when I thought I did know something. But fortunately, there are many people who have helped us understand a little bit more about teams. And one of the ones that I'm sure you're quite sick of is being told, can't you just be like a Formula One team? Wouldn't it be great? You could just have this beautiful linear sequence in your airway management. That would be lovely. And indeed, Formula One has much to teach us. Formula One is a fantastic exemplar for those elements of our performance as individuals and teams that can be codified, that are linear, and where our interdependence is what Amy Edmondson would call pooled. If everyone just does their job, it goes well. The teamwork kind of is the sum of its parts, not much more. And one of the things also that Formula One has taught us is how better you can get. One of my anaesthetic colleagues at the Gold Coast has a video of a pit stop from 1950s, and it took 67 seconds. And now we know that those teams are doing it in 1.8. So what actually we can learn from Formula One is how they learned to get better. So this is one way we might think about teams. Another one that we get told very often, why not we be more like the cockpit? That would be great too. And there's no doubt that this is probably what the teamwork people would call complicated. i.e. there's not just a pretty simple linear process, but there's lots of linear processes. And the interdependence here is probably what Amy Edmondson would call sequential. That if we make sure that everybody else has done their bit and we do our bit, it's slightly more than the sum of its parts. But, so again, we've got something to learn from aviation, and they cottoned on to the idea also, earlier than us, about these ideas about crew resource management and more. But I'm suspecting that more of you work in environments like this. And this is what we would call complex. And the interdependence here is what you call reciprocal, i.e. something happens in the corner of one room, of that room, and it affects lots of other people in the rest of the room. In fact, someone just needs to press the wrong click and order the wrong blood products on a computer in the corner, and suddenly what happens in the middle with the patient is affected, and vice versa. So in this case, our interdependence is reciprocal. And I think that's a really nice concept that I've heard about, and that is that we really need to think about what each other are doing. So yeah, this is complex. So yeah, we probably also do have Formula One Airways every now and again, don't we? And we would like to think that we apply some of that, let's be smooth, we don't need to talk much, those Formula One teams don't even talk to each other, let's just do our jobs, and works really nice, and we've probably got lots of implicit coordination. But you and I know there are also volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous airways. And what I think we need to think about is that we can diagnose and distinguish between these two. And yet when you look at most of our airway management as teams and as individuals, we kind of feel like we're training the same way for these two very different challenges. So I guess one of the things as teams is our ability to adapt, to diagnose and adapt when we need to switch from being Formula One airway team to a VUCA airway team. Now, here we've talked about the teams, but what I really want to talk about is the teamwork. And the reason for that is increasingly in healthcare, we're doing less of thinking about who's on our team and how we label them, and instead thinking that when we come together, how do we team? Teaming is a verb, team is a noun. Now, we do need a good team, don't get me wrong. We need all your collective left arms and right hands and all those other things that we use to do our airway management. But we also need a new capacity that maybe we didn't need when there were just two of us looking after a patient 50 years ago. And that is to be able to team, and that is a skill set. And I think that's something we've just talked about, teamwork as something that happens that, again, is the sum of our parts, whereas teaming is a skill, and it's become a harder skill in these complex environment. So here's where most of us, I think, sit when we think about teamwork. We've got some of these words that we throw around. Did you have good situation awareness? We had a really good shared mental model. I quite like these words. Behind each of those words is a massive body of literature that is a lot more than most of us appreciate, I think, particularly things like situation awareness. You know, that's not a function of the team, of the person at the head of the team. That is a function of the team itself and how it does that. So these things are good. And what we do know, though, is if teams engage in these behaviours, we do have better outcomes. What we don't always appreciate is that sometimes we diagnose a lack of these things and think we can just train the behaviours themselves. And I don't know about you, but I think most of us are a little bit more complicated than the Skinner box chickens that came up and when they pecked here, they got a grain, and so they did it a bit more. Most of our training doesn't really rest with just behavioural monkey see, monkey do. We have to work on other factors underneath this if we are actually to do those behaviours. Interesting studies. People train to do closed-loop communication. They don't actually do it unless you've worked on these other things underneath, even if you've told people how to do it. So, I'll come back to what that means for our training shortly. But the other thing that teams allow us to do is to improve our systems. And again, everyone in this room, I'm sure, has a very great appreciation, and I love the example from COVID, where we thought really hard about, are our systems working for us? And in fact, some of what we did in COVID was discovered that our everyday systems didn't work for us because suddenly we were putting a spotlight on it and we were testing it and we were iteratively testing using simulation and we were actually talking about it as interprofessional teams. And in fact, we know that teams often mitigate the deficiencies in systems, but they're also powerful agents of system improvement. And so thinking how we can do that. So this is a photograph, or it's actually a still shot from a video of a simulation that we did at the Gold Coast. And this was actually fairly early in our simulation days. And I really like this photo because of the multidisciplinary group that is in here. And in fact, there's a ED registrar at the head of the bed. That's actually an anaesthetic consultant who's craning her neck around to look at the CMAC there. There's an ED nurse, there's an ED consultant. In fact, there's another anaesthetic consultant just behind the ED person. And, I think there's a couple of things I would say about this kind of environment. We might imagine whether it was our maxillofacial trauma or any other situation. And that is that this is a classic example where the competence is collective. Again, more than the sum of its parts. Collective competence is something where an individual can be on a down day, but the team can still be competent. Or an individual can be very good, but the team can be incompetent. So I think this is a nice, the terminology for us to think about the skill set of emergency airway management, probably even elective airway management, as being a collective competence. Another word that we've used before, this is an example where all of us are going to depend on each other. And even the emergency consultant at the head of the bed, who it feels like is a little bit away from the action, we know that decisions made at that level, the sensing of what's going on at that level is going to affect everything else. And this is an example where we need to team. And one of the things that I really like about this picture, and I think back, is that the skill set is about how this team works. It's not just a linear suggestion of here's a bunch of rules that are going to make it work. And I'll give you an example. When I was giving a talk about simulation and airway management, it was actually in a different country, one that thinks it's probably a bit better than ours, and at an institution that definitely thinks it's a bit better than any of ours. And I said, in my emergency medicine career, we've had this bit of a contested thing about who owned the emergency airway. Was it emergency medicine or was it anaesthesia? I said, ridiculous, really, because, obviously the patient owns the airway. And someone put up their hand and said, no, we've got that sorted. I said, oh, great. They said, Monday's emergency medicine, Tuesday's anaesthesia. So they had clearly decided their territorial fight was much more important than what this patient actually needed. And, if that's acceptable to an institution, great, but I don't think it is. And I think what instead we need is to have the capacity to team. Because on any given day, there'll be an interesting mix of people. The patient will have various factors that are going to be requiring consideration into making a plan. And our skill set is in making the plan and communicating it and executing it. It's not actually in deciding whether it's Monday or Tuesday. Another simulation here, maybe this was the one. So I think if we come back to my challenge that I thought about at the beginning, the factors that I think will influence this are individual capabilities. We do need those in the room, and we need to know how to bring them to bear on this patient's particular airway challenges. The other thing that are going to matter is the cognitions. Do we have a shared mental model about what we're going to do, and have we been able to establish that shared mental model both before the patient arrived as well as once they arrived? Have we got a high level of communication? Has there been information exchange about what we needed to do? Have we got a high level of cooperation, which is a shared understanding that we have got a joint problem-solving orientation, not a, well, my advice is this, but you do what you like. But ultimately, have we got it underpinned by those values, trusts, and familiarity? And I take communication as just an example of one. Believe me, I could talk all day about different teamwork concepts, but communication is a good one, isn't it? Because people love saying, oh, it was a communication failure, communication should have been better. The reality is communication also need to be diagnosed in a team and adapted for what we want. And everyone says, oh, it's really good when it's quiet. Well, it is if you've got the right setting for there to be very little communication. So if you think about it, if you've got your elective case that you've been able to do a good assessment of, that you're working with your standard team in your usual environment, then that can almost be done without talking. Whereas if you were down in the example that we've talked about, I hope there is a lot of talking. I hope it's not too quiet. I hope the communication is ordered, but I would like to think there was far more explicit communication. And deciding where to draw that line, that's the communication skill. Well, it's certainly one of them. It's not just how well can you close the loop. And believe me, sometimes we do way too much of that. So thinking about what is the right time to have a right communication. So I guess in the last bit of this, having thought about teams itself, I wanted to think about how do we then get better? Because it's one thing to have a nice little static model of teamwork. It's another thing entirely to think, how do we actually get that model turned into actions, turned into something else? And this is perhaps a simulation that might have been a little bit like the example that I gave before. This was one where we did have a airway burn situation, and there was potentially going to need to be a need for a front of neck airway access. And our ENT surgeon, who was the man standing there at that time, I wish we'd had a heart rate monitor on him, because he was sweating buckets, which I thought was quite interesting. But it wasn't necessarily because there was nothing wrong with his left and right hand. It was because for him, this was the most unfamiliar environment. If you just said, walk in and please do a surgical airway, he would have been fine. But the things that were stressing him out was he didn't know any of these people. He didn't know what they could all do. He didn't know when would be appropriate for him to step in. And in the debrief, he actually said to me, well, who's the leader here when it comes down to it? I said, that's just not the right question. You know, this is a collective competence, and yes, we're going to have someone who's in charge of strategy, but that is only going to be one small part of whether this happens right. So yes, I do use simulation, and you'll have to indulge me a little bit because I think that is one of the ways that we can get better. So I'm going to focus a little bit on that. But I think one of the things that we have underestimated with simulation is our ability to explore performance, to help us understand more of these aspects of how teams work and don't. Obviously, in COVID, we learned how simulation could help us to test systems and test better ways, but also to embed, and I guess that's our traditional use of simulation for education. So there's no doubt that if we're here in our simulated environment, we may well be learning lots of technical skills, but you can see here the opportunity is much more. And I think if we're learning technical skills, then all the things you're doing at the workshops today are a brilliant way of doing that. But if we're going to this much trouble of getting ourselves an actor who pretended he had a garrote across his neck and did a really good job, I thought he might get his CO2 down to about 15 and he might actually flake out. But he did a beautiful job. But the team actually were confronted by quite a difficult situation. So yes, I think the technical challenges are helpful in simulation, but again, that's not the opportunity here. What we really had the opportunity to do was think about how does a team come together and do their teaming when it involves an ENT surgeon, an anaesthetist, emergency department team, intensive care teams as well. And then how do we have the systems that allow us to decide, are we doing that here or in theatre, who's doing what, and how can we help? And simulation is really good for testing some really basic stuff. This is Andrew Petrosoniak's work from Toronto, where they did a heat map of 3 different approaches to doing a front of neck access. The person over in the far side there did it in 90 seconds, and that's because they had a kit that was pre-prepared, and it just went very nicely. Thank you very much. The person here just wanted a couple of little extra things because they like to do it a certain way, and it took them about 2.5 minutes. The person at the top had a very sure idea about the different equipment that they wanted and ran around the storeroom trying to get it, and it took them 6.5 minutes. But this kind of heat map thing, very useful for seeing actually what do people do, because we're not very good at going, we think we do something versus what we actually do. So sometimes simulation is really good for testing this kind of thing. Simulation can be very good. I've been doing some work this year on stress exposure simulations. I have some thoughts about that if people are interested. But one of the things that we did do was put heart rate monitors on the people who were engaged in the training. And what you can see there are their numbers and their percent of maximums. So this is very interesting. When people hear what's coming, their heart rate goes like this. As soon as they know what their role is, it goes down. It's astounding, even before the patient arrives. But you can tell here who thought they were going to be in a bit of trouble, because the team leader heart rate was 144 and the airway doctors was 157. And that was before the patient even arrived. So, but this is a good way for helping teams recognise and regulate their emotional activation so that they can preserve performance. As I said, I've got some strong views about that. It is not to inoculate them against stress, and I'll leave it at that. You can actually use simulation to train for mental rehearsal. Actually we do all these sims and stuff, but if you pull out the bottom drawer of your Airway trolley while you're sitting there in a case, and then just you and the Airway assistant step through the sequence of your front of neck access for 90 seconds, and if you do that once a week, low volume, high frequency training, it's probably as good as going to another workshop, as long as you've probably been to the first workshop. But mental rehearsal, incredibly powerful way of maintaining skills. Simulation can be really simple. We do a lot of simulation, particularly around decision making, still multidisciplinary, multi-professional, using visually enhanced mental simulation. Don't need to go out and get mannequins if you're thinking about how to practice coordination of teamwork and exploring what people are thinking in the meantime. We even do that for very little people. We've been doing some work with our neonatal intensive care unit. They were very pleased that we managed to get some beanies, because beanies are really important in the NICU. But it's interesting, you can still practice the coordination, the teamwork. I know, imagine, size 2 tube goes in. And again, you can see you can actually get quite a lot of engagement with teams, just with very simple stuff like that. So if people are interested, very happy to talk about it. And we've got templates for kids if you're really interested. But in terms of what we focus on, I would say without fear or favour that most of our time is spent in the bottom box when we do simulation. Yes, we're focusing on the task work. Yes, we're focusing on the behaviours. But mostly what we're doing is helping to bond the team. And this last Saturday, I was actually in a room with similar Airway experts, our Gold Coast anaesthesia group, who were having a trauma day. But what was amazing to me and impressive was that trauma day was littered with people from other parts of the hospital. It was, again, recognising, like the people in this room, that this is what we need to do. Sure, we'll be talking about our skills, we'll be talking about our knowledge, but ultimately it is about shaping that culture. And that is something that we can actually do. And I think one of the things that I used to think was that culture was we were victims of what we got. And I work here, it's good culture, I work there, it's not so good. Actually, we can shape the kind of culture. And I think after 20 years of doing it, this is probably the biggest impact of simulation, is that we role model and practice having respectful conversations about performance and how it can be better. Because if you think about it, those conversations are relatively rare in healthcare. For a lot of reasons, not because we're difficult or nasty. It's busy, our jobs. And so to take that time to be able to think, how can we do it better? And please tell me why you did what you did, because I don't understand. We often don't get those opportunities. And I think this is actually what simulation's potential gift is to healthcare, is helping us have time and space to do that, and hopefully being a role model for other conversations like that. Even I get to dress up like the anaesthetist every now and again and have some of those conversations. And we'll talk about this later on today, but I guess in thinking about the similarities and some important differences with after-action review, this is hands down the way to improve, is to have conversations about what we do. But as I said, the last thing I really want to focus on is this shaping culture. And we have probably spent the last 5 or 6 years, Eve Purdy has led a lot of this work, really examining what happens with the culture of groups, particularly around trauma, but in fact in emergency departments, critical care, around culture, around simulation and the things that affect that. Turns out that even if you're a sim person, you've got to be very aware of what's coming into your simulations, because you'll be able to achieve much more if, like me, you're fortunate enough to have a team who's been doing interprofessional simulations for 10 years around trauma. And so people are going to come to the sim ready to go, ready to test themselves, ready to learn, and you're going to be able to push them much harder. But likewise, if you have done good things in the sim, they're going to go back out and do good things. Notice there's also a downside. If people come to you and have a really bad experience in simulations, it can be quite harmful. And again, that's another talk, but simulation is not just neutral. The things that we do in there, the choices we make about what we simulate, who plays what roles, how our team is composed, send powerful messages back to the workplace. And one of the early actually studies that we did was looking at what were the impacts of these kind of simulations on people. And they did come up with some technical aspects about learning the new protocols for Cat A head injuries, et cetera, But people mainly came up with a lot more of this about the outcomes, and I've just got a few quotes that I'll let you read. So, these aren't surprising to people that have done that, but I think it's interesting to see the sheer volume that we found in those examples. So as a result of this, we actually have a sort of conceptual model that we take into all of our team training activities, most of which are simulation, but a lot of which are other activities as well. And that is shared goals, shared knowledge, including of each other's roles, and mutual respect. And I think we say those things explicitly now about what it is that we're trying to achieve. So for us, that has even shaped the way that we think about our team training and our simulation at the Gold Coast. And I put this up just as a little bit of an example for how the structures and processes in institutions, I think, can have an impact on what we can achieve. So we're still very keen on the idea of training in courses. Those individual capabilities are important, and I think you can still achieve many things that are team-based as well. There are team behaviours that we should be practicing. So we do plenty of that kind of stuff as well. But we have got a whole pillar that we've dedicated now to team and system performance. And so some of those simulations happen in situ, not all of them, but where the aim and the purpose really is shaping our teams and shaping our systems in order to do that. And that triangle that I had before of, really what are we trying to achieve out of that? It is helping people to have a culture where they're ready to improve and recognising that probably the best people to do that are the teams themselves. So I'm going to leave it at that. I don't know if you want any questions for now, but I guess in summary, thinking back to that example, our individual capabilities are important. But I think teams are more complex than we've thought. I think any of us working in teams, leading teams, coaching teams, probably owe it to ourselves to do some deeper dives into team science, because it is amazing what has been found. But more importantly, we have to think about how we're going to execute that knowledge of team science, how we're going to actually use tools like simulation, but certainly not solely simulation, to be able to develop those teams, to have those shared beliefs and values underpinning excellent behaviours and then excellent skills. So thank you very much.